Happy New Year, folks. Tim Freitas here with the Garden of English. Super sorry I haven't produced videos for quite a long while, but with 5 kids in the holiday season, things do indeed get crazy. But this is indeed the new year, so that makes sense to have a new video for today. What we're going to do over the next few sets of videos is talk about annotating for rhetorical analysis and just annotating readings, and hopefully these annotations will be helpful in helping kids construct better rhetorical analysis essays, but also help with the multiple choice section of the AP exam. Not only the questions that we're used to that have been the rhetorical analysis questions on the old exams, but also those new reading like a writer types of questions that are also on the new exam. So without further ado, I'm going to just go through a couple of steps today here about annotations. The packet that I'm going to put in as a link or as a file below the video does include more steps for annotating and reading more critically, but I'll go through most of those steps throughout the rest of the videos that we do. But nonetheless, with that being said, I'm going to shrink myself here and I'm going to bring up a packet so that you can indeed see what I use when I talk about annotating. So before I get into annotating what I'd like to, which I have my kids focus on rhetorical modes and parts of argument structure, I will say this: before my kids actually annotate for those things, they are going to read a reading selection and they're going to break it into sections. Now, I don't particularly care how many sections kids break it into, as long as they can tell me why they broke it into the amount of sections that they did. Sometimes I have students that notice organizational changes and they can break a short reading into 5 sections. Sometimes kids do it into 3. I typically mandate, though, that kids have at least 3 sections, because then I know that they're trying to say, hey, here's how the text seems to relate or grow or organically move as it's being produced. But anyway, I'm going to call your attention over here, because after I have kids break the text into sections, what I do is I have them annotate down the left-hand side of the page for rhetorical modes, or the new way that we talk about rhetorical modes is by calling them methods of development. Now, I want to remind you, if you look right up top here, I'm going to try to highlight this if I can. Yeah. That I do use my definition of rhetoric as being using language to construct meaning. And so the reason why I use methods of development is because they help with this concrete side of things, because that's what language is: anything concrete that conveys anything abstract. And so to teach kids how to identify what's going on in the language and what the author is concretely doing, I use methods of development. And once again, that's the same as rhetorical modes. So I do use 8 of them. There are actually 9 here, but I do put narration and description together. But what I'll do is, before I read a selection with my students, or actually I'll have them read it through once and break it into sections, we'll go back, and before we provide other annotations, what we're going to do is we're going to actually define these terms here. So I'll use narration and description, and they'll have to memorize these definitions. I'll use problem and solution. I'll use process analysis, compare and contrast, division and classification, cause and effect, definition, and exemplification. And what I'll do is, as I go through the definitions with the kids, I will discuss with them, hey, here's what the qualities of narration are. Here's what the qualities of process analysis are. Here's what the qualities of compare and contrast are. And I'll put them in pairs, and then I'll say, hey, let's actually read something. And down the left-hand side of the page, what we'll do is we'll actually make little annotations. When we see a reading that or a text that has qualities that fit with any one of these definitions, we'll just make a little note there. And it's super quick notes. So gone are the days of kids saying, I don't know what to annotate, or they just circle things or just highlight things and put little question marks. I'm giving them real purposeful things to actually look for, besides saying circle your metaphors or your figurative language or things like that. I want them to actually identify an author's method of development. Now, this is going to be really helpful later on, because we can turn a lot of these methods of development into verbs to say what the author is doing. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to actually just scroll down a little bit on here, and I am going to find this article here. He showed us the way. It's an article by Cesar Chavez that was on the 2015 AP Lang Exam question 2. Now, on the AP Lang exam, it did not have the intro paragraph and it did not have the conclusion, but that's okay. What we're going to do is we're going to just take a look at this, and I'm going to just go through and read parts of it, and I'm just going to write down and show you how I would have my kids annotate it. Now, one of the things that we're going to notice, or that you might notice as you're watching this, is that as I go through here and annotate and make just quick little marks on my page, as I annotate, you might say, well, I don't agree that that's that particular method of development. I think it's a different one. But that's okay, because a lot of times our text can actually exemplify a different methods of development or multiple, and we want to let kids know that. We want kids to have a conversation. If one kid thinks it's process analysis, but another one thinks it's actually compare and contrast, I'm going to have them, kind of discuss that, and it might actually have elements of both, and then they're going to say, okay, which one seems to be the more prominent type of method of development. So with that being said, as we look at this together as well, I would like to point out that this whole piece is indeed a problem and solution piece. So the method of development that could classify the whole piece is problem solution. But as we go through, you're going to realize very quickly that we're going to be able to see multiple modes coming up. What's really good about classroom conversations is that if you have kids annotating for a rhetorical mode, and different kids see different qualities within certain sections, they then have to say, okay, I'm going to claim that it's this mode, here's my evidence for such, and then they have to reason it out with their partners as they make their annotations. That's really nice because it helps kids also practice making claims, finding evidence, and then also providing reasoning. On top of that, when two kids, and you'll get this a lot if you do this in your classroom, when two kids are saying, I feel like it's this and it's that, it's great to tell kids that it's both. A lot of times, particularly in high school, kids still want to put English in boxes. They want to say, this is a simile, this is a metaphor, this is symbolism, this is personification, and they want it to just be in a box. And I'm like, well, what if symbolism is a type of metaphor? What if a simile is a type of metaphor? What if personification is a type of metaphor? And I want to show kids that English isn't just like a bunch of boxes that we put things in. English can be like nesting dolls. It can be one doll that's also 8 dolls, or it can be 8 individual dolls at the same time. And so we want to try to show that to the kids here too, that it doesn't just have to be exemplification. It doesn't just have to be cause and effect. It could be, it could have qualities of all of these here. But anyway, let's actually read this here together, and what we'll do is I'll make a couple notes as I go through. I might skip a couple sections. You can read it on your own, and this is just to give you a sample. But after I actually provide a couple notes, we're going to talk about, okay, how do these notes actually help us label rhetorical strategies later on when we're trying to write a paper. So anyway, here we go. We have the article, He Showed Us the Way, by Cesar Chavez, originally showing up in Mary Knoll magazine. So here we go. It says, in honoring Martin Luther King Jr.'s memory, we also acknowledge nonviolence as a truly powerful weapon to achieve equality and liberation. In fact, the only weapon that Christians who struggle for social change can claim as their own. Now, interestingly enough, with this first paragraph, I will have students that want to begin by suggesting that this is actually cause and effect. And I'll ask kids, well, why is it cause and effect? So they'll actually annotate right here with a little C/E. It's that simple. And that cause and effect is, they'll say, well, it's the memorial of Martin Luther King Jr.'s death. And because of that, that's moved him to actually produce this piece about nonviolence. And I'm like, okay, that's reasonable. So I will tell kids that's fine. What they also like to do, though, is they'll go through this first passage and they'll say, wait a second, a solution is already offered. Because it says here that nonviolence is a powerful weapon for struggle here. So if people are struggling, which is a problem, indeed there is a solution that's offered. So the kids will just annotate a little cause and effect / solution, and I'll say, okay, that's reasonable. Those are reasonable elements here. Now, I will encourage kids to continue to move on, though, just for the sake of finding a more appropriate mode while they're reading for this kind of beginning section of the piece. So as we continue, and let me just highlight where we are here, okay, right here. It says, Dr. King's entire life was an example of power that nonviolence brings to bear in the real world. It's an example that inspired much of the philosophy and strategy from the farm workers movement. And this observance of Dr. King's death gives us the best possible opportunity to recall the principles with which our struggle has grown and matured. So what's going to happen here is I'm going to go back and ask the kids, okay, now that we've read 2 paragraphs, can we say that there are more evident methods of development? And a lot of times they can pick out the 2 major ones that happen in this first section. And that's going to be exemplification, right? Because we know that Martin Luther King Jr. is an example of the power of nonviolence, which is what this piece is about. And on top of that, we're going to notice that right here, okay, he's an example that has inspired much of the philosophy and strategy of the farm workers movement. And so because of that, now we are moving into a type of comparison. So the kids, they'll just mark this up. So we've got a C and E, and I'm sorry for the messy handwriting, but I'm trying to write on my screen with a cursor here. But really, I want the kids to say, okay, look at, there's some cause and effect. We've got the anniversary of his death. It's moving him to actually write this piece or talk about the power of nonviolence. The power of nonviolence is a solution for a problem. But at the beginning here, what he's really doing is he's exemplifying Martin Luther King Jr. and the values that he holds as being an icon. And he's also then comparing the farm workers movement to the profitability of the civil rights movement. So that's how this annotation method essentially works. So we'll go through a little bit more, and we'll talk about a couple more methods of development before I actually talk about how this is valuable for rhetorical strategies, and then we'll be done with part 1 for annotations. But let's pick up right here. It says, our conviction is that human life is a very special possession given by God to man, and that no one has the right to take it for any cause, however just it may be. And it says, we are also convinced that nonviolence is more powerful than violence. Now, what's going to happen here is I'm going to highlight for the students that it says human life is, okay, a special possession given by God to man. And what happens is the kids are going to realize that he's defining the convictions of the movement. So they're going to write a little def here for definition, okay? And sure enough, we also have nonviolence provides an opportunity to stay on the offensive, and that is of crucial importance to win any contest. If we look right in here, we do have a problem and a solution. If we have a contest, we have a solution here, and that will be focusing on how to deal with this non-violently. So we have the convictions of the farm workers movement defined here. We've got human life being defined as valuable, as a possession given by God. We've got the solution, protest non-violently. And the kids are just making little notes here, and they're going to just say, okay, hey, here's why I think this exhibits elements of definition. Here's what I think this exhibits elements of problem and solution. So now if we continue here, now we'll scroll down a little bit. We're at where it says if. It says, if we resort to nonviolence, then one of 2 things will happen. Either the violence will be escalated and there will be many injuries and perhaps deaths on both sides, or there will be total demoralization of the workers. And sure enough, this little section, this is easy for kids to identify. They're going to be like, oh, that's cause and effect. The problem is that if they only work with this particular paragraph on its own, and it's right, it is cause and effect, they're going to miss the greater method of development that's used throughout the majority of the piece. Because in the next paragraph, which starts right here, it says nonviolence has the exact opposite effect. If for every violent act committed against us, we respond with nonviolence, we attract people's support. We can gather the support of millions who have a conscience and would rather see a nonviolent resolution to problems. We are convinced that when people are faced with a direct appeal from the poor struggling nonviolently against great odds, they will react positively. The American people and people everywhere yearn for justice, and it's to that yearning that we appeal. So what happens if we look at this particular section, we're going to notice that this cause and effect up here is actually meant to contrast the cause and effect here. So I'm going to just have the kids annotate contrast, and so now they'll actually see how this bigger section actually functions. It's meant to showcase the effects, and that's going to help us later on when we talk about rhetorical strategies, because the kids will say, oh, he contrasts the negative effects of violence with the positive effects of nonviolence. Now, another moment here is we do want to try to show kids about discourse markers, and we can see that with the word but. So we can see more contrast here, and that will actually show up again a little later on. But notice here, as we continue reading, it says, if we are committed to nonviolence only as a strategy or tactic, then if it fails, our only alternative is to turn to violence. Okay, so we've got some cause and effect here in that first little sentence. So my kids will typically intake cause and effect. And now it says, so we must balance the strategy with a clear understanding of what we're doing. However important the struggle is, however much misery, poverty, and exploitations exist, we know that it cannot be more important than one human life. We work on the theory that men and women who are truly concerned about people are non-violent by nature. And these people become violent when the deep concern they have for people is frustrated when they are faced with seemingly insurmountable odds. So we're going to notice we've got some more cause and effect here. We also are going to label this with a little p, and the reason why is because he is beginning to outline a potential problem. Sure enough, though, we have this continued where it says, we advocate militant nonviolence as our means of achieving justice for our people. We are not blind to the feelings of frustration, impatience, and anger which seethe inside every farm worker. The burdens of generations of poverty and powerlessness lie heavy in the fields of America, and if we fail, there are those who will see violence as a shortcut to change. So notice we're going to continue with this idea of he's presenting a potential problem here that does need to be worked out. And yet, you're going to realize right after, very soon, we have our answer. And so it says here, it is precisely to overcome these frustrations that we have involved masses of people in their own struggle. Throughout the movement, freedom is best experienced through participation and self-determination, and free men and women instinctively prefer democratic change to any other means. So here is indeed our solution. So my kids will mark a little S there. And it shows the contrast as well between people that want to take the shortcut and people that don't. So my students can label that as contrast as well. As we continue, we're going to look at this part here, which starts with thus. So it says, thus, demonstrations and marches and strikes and boycotts are not only weapons against the growers, but our way of avoiding the senseless violence that brings no honor to any class or community. The boycott, as Gandhi taught, is the most nearly perfect instrument of nonviolent change, allowing masses of people to participate actively in a cause. And this is a great paragraph to mark exemplification for multiple reasons. We do have examples of ways that people can work nonviolently here and protest nonviolently, but we also see the exemplification of Gandhi's teachings as well. And that ties in nicely with Dr. Martin Luther King as being a famous figure where this has actually worked. Now, we do want to point out, though, is that one thing I'd like to point out is that throughout here, he does kind of showcase people that are becoming increasingly frustrated in the movement, and we could say that there is a little bit of classification in there. He's classifying the two types of farm workers, those that are still willing to be nonviolent, but those who are getting frustrated with how long that takes. But nonetheless, this really starts to begin showing itself in the next paragraph. So we're going to start right here. And it says, when victory comes through violence, it's a victory with strings attached. And so sure enough, we see cause and effect right here. So my students are going to put a little C/E. But we also want to see where it says, if we beat the growers at the expense of violence, victory could come at the expense of injury and perhaps death. And such a thing would have a tremendous impact on us. We would lose our regard for human beings. Then the struggle would become a mechanical thing, and when you lose your sense of life and justice, you lose your strength. So we do see some cause and effect here again at the end, but we also want to recognize that there is a lot of classification and division. So my kids are going to write CL/div here, and we see that with the us and the we. He'll also classify the movement as being humane and powerful when it's not violent, but if it is violent, it's going to be classified as something that is indeed inhumane. And so we see that kind of separation that's built there. particularly with the pronouns and the negative images there. Now, next we have the greater the oppression, the more leverage nonviolence holds. Okay, once again, we've got cause and effect and problem solution there. It says violence does not work in the long run, and if it's temporarily successful, it replaces one form of power with another just as violent, and people suffer from violence. So my kids will just label that with a C/E. And then we have examine history. Who gets killed in the case of a violent revolution? The poor and the workers. Now, interestingly enough, this is a logical fallacy. However, my kids are going to most likely put exemplification there because he tries to exemplify elements of history. He doesn't do a good job with concrete examples. I might talk to my students about that. That's why we need concrete examples. But they'll still mark that. Anyway, it says the people of the land are the ones who give their bodies and don't really gain much for it. We believe that's too big a price to pay for not getting anything. Those who espouse violence exploit people. And notice here, we are classifying, so they might put a little class here, although I do try to keep the annotations on the left-hand side, and we'll see why in my next video, but that's okay. It says to call men to arms with many promises, to ask them to give up their lives for a cause and then not produce for them afterwards, is the most vicious type of oppression. And so notice he defines oppression through exemplification here. So we could mark a little definition here. It says, we know that most likely we are not going to do anything else for the rest of our lives except build our union, and for us there's nowhere else to go. Although we'd like to see victory come soon, we're willing to wait. In this sense, time is our ally. We learned many years ago that the rich may have money, but the poor have time. So notice he's classifying and dividing people here. So class div. And we'll finish up here. It says, it has been our experience that few men or women have ever had the opportunity to know the true satisfaction that comes with giving one's life totally in the nonviolent struggle for justice. Martin Luther King Jr. was one of those unique servants, and from him we learned many of the lessons that guided us. For these lessons and for the sacrifice for the poor and oppressed, Dr. Martin Luther King's memory will be cherished in it should say hearts, not hears, hearts of the farm workers forever. And sure enough, we are going to notice that at the end here, he goes back to the example of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in order to compare him once again to the farm workers unit. So, farm workers union. So anyway, if you just look as I scroll through here, these aren't a lot of annotations. They can produce good conversations. We see an intermixing of methods of development. And now what's happening too is that we have movements for kids to kind of look at here. It's like, oh, he shifts from a cause and effect to offering a solution to defining. And this can help kids as they try to actually navigate through a text. The other reason why this is indeed quite beneficial is found on a couple pages later in just the next page actually in this document that I have referenced in the notes down below the video. And that is, if you look at this list here that says rhetorical verbs. My students are not allowed to use the word uses, employs, or utilizes. And the reason why is because if I go back to my definition of what a rhetorical strategy is, it's going to be what the author is doing. It's anything an author or speaker does to construct meaning. And so now if kids can annotate for these, what I've done is I've created a verb list that actually has 3 or 4 verbs that kids can memorize that work with the method of development. Oh, sorry, I forgot to turn my notes off there. I'll have to erase that. Let's see if I can do that right here. There we go. So what happens here is if the kids can find the method of development, they now have verbs that they can tie to the author. So instead of saying uses diction or uses syntax, if the kids are up at the beginning and they see that this is exemplification, they can actually say, oh, okay, what is Chavez doing here at the beginning and even at the end? And if I go to exemplification, I've got the verb exemplifies, and the students can say something along the lines of, oh, he exemplifies the success of a national icon, or exemplifies a national icon. And that can help them. Now, you can easily Google search a verb list, and you can get like 200 to 300 verbs that kids can pull from. I originally used those, but then what I did was I took the list and I just pared it down into verbs I think kids actually know and use, and then I put them in with my first piece of annotation, which is methods of development. For part 2, we'll talk about classical argument structure, but that'll be in the next video. Anyway, I narrowed down the list because I noticed that when I gave kids a lot of verbs, what they chose to do was they like to use lampoon or bamboozle, shellac, or things like that, and I didn't want them using verbs that were not going to be academically appropriate. So here, this just gives them verbs that they can use if they notice their methods of development or their prominent methods of development. So what I'm going to do just super quickly before we finish up this video is I'm going to go through and just talk about, okay, here's the mode that we picked for this particular section. Here's how we could label this as what Chavez is doing. And these are the rhetorical choices that Chavez makes, essentially. So in this first section here, where we have exemplification and comparison, I have Chavez exemplifies the success of a national icon. When we move on to our next section, I could say, he defines the values of the farm workers movement. However, before I do that, though, if I were to even deal with this first section with comparison, I could say that he compares the just ideologies of the civil rights movement with the farm workers union and their movement. When I get to this particular section, I could say he defines the value and dignity of human life. If I move to this section, I could say he contrasts the negative outcomes of violence with the positive outcomes of nonviolence. If I come down here, I could say he highlights potential frustrations. You'll see highlights as one of the verbs in problem solution, so that's going to help us there. Next, with the solution part, he provides positive solutions. We can also say he offers examples of potential solutions here. As I continue, if I move down, when we get down here, and when it talks about history and whatnot, he characterizes the oppressive nature of violence down here. And then, sure enough, when we get into our last 2 paragraphs here, we see here in this classification of the poor, he classifies them as actually being powerful and having something to stand for. And then at the end, he concludes by, once again, exemplifying Martin Luther King Jr. and the value that he has for the people. So notice that these little annotations can give me some really pertinent verbs that we can then use to say, okay, so what is the author doing here? What is the author actually exemplifying here? What is the author actually contrasting here? What is the author actually highlighting here? Or the speaker, if you want to use that term. So this is a quick way to get kids to annotate. It's practically cheat proof because if the kids have the same exact annotations, that means they've read it the exact same way. Most likely not going to happen. Don't forget, once again, that I also tell kids they have to break it into sections before we actually start doing our rhetorical modes down the left-hand side. So that's only the first part of our annotation, though. We'll do another video probably in a couple days or a little bit later on next week that talks about the second part of rhetorical annotation because the first part is going to take care of the concrete. What is the author actually doing? The second part is going to take care of the meaning side, which is the why, and we're going to use the classical model for that. If you want to scroll through this document, you'll be able to see examples of other things that I do for annotations and a nice little organizer that helps with this. I'll give you a little sneak peek right here. I think. Yeah, here it is. I'll give you a sneak peek right here. But you can go through that on your own time. I will go through these in the video to come. Now, with all of this being said, I would like to just bring up one more point here. This is the new year, and I am going to try to make a few more videos this year as opposed to having almost a month and a half in between videos. But like I said, we're going to try to get back onto a weekly or bi-weekly schedule. But I do want to just point out here that over the new year, the Garden of English did indeed, decide to rebrand, and I had a former student actually create our new image here. So this is a t-shirt, Garden of English t-shirt, and I just want to say that if you want to actually win this t-shirt for free, or actually a t-shirt of the color of your choice. It doesn't have to be this one, and your size. I'm going to ask that you subscribe. Once we get to 200 subscribers, I am going to actually do a giveaway for this particular t-shirt, and I can contact whomever, and they can get the color and size that they actually want. On top of that, though, if you're going to subscribe and you want to be entered to win the t-shirt, you do have to just produce a comment on this video, ask a question, just say following, or just put I want the t-shirt. That's fine with me, but I will send that to you. That won't be a problem. But once again, if you want to win that, you're going to comment below, you're going to subscribe, and once I get to 200, we're going to send out a Garden of English t-shirt. So until next week, or maybe the week after, this is Tim Freitas from the Garden of English, and I hope you all have a beautiful day.